This video is a supplemental lecture that expands upon material covered in the video entitled Stoic Indifference, Harm, and Confronting Death, and you can find a link to that video in the description section below. A fundamental tenet of the Stoic philosophy, as espoused by Epictetus and others, is that self-control is the key to living well. Specifically, we live well by controlling our desires and aversions. The Stoic limits his desires to that which it is within his power to obtain, and limits his aversions to that which it is within his power to avoid. This video will explore this topic further by considering the following questions. What is desire? What is aversion? Why should we learn to control these things? And what is the consequence if we fail to do so? How can we transform our ingrained habits of finding some things desirable and other things aversive? Are some things simply too dreadful and fear-provoking for us to overcome our aversion toward them? Are other things simply too attractive and pleasurable for us to overcome our desire for them? Furthermore, we will see that Epictetus does not treat desire and aversion in precisely the same way. He seems more optimistic about our ability to control our aversions than about our ability to control our desires. And why is this? What differentiates the nature of desire from the nature of aversion? In answering these questions, the focus of this video will be on a single paragraph from Epictetus' work. Specifically, this is the paragraph found in section 2 of the Enchiridion. In section 2 of the Enchiridion, Epictetus provides the following definitions of desire and aversion. Epictetus explains that desire demands the attainment of that which you are desirous, and aversion demands the avoidance of that to which you are averse. We should already be familiar with the concepts of desire and aversion because in section 1 of the Enchiridion, Epictetus identifies these as examples of things that are within our power. It may not be within our power to obtain health, wealth, power, and status, but we are in control of what we desire, and we are in control of what we find aversive. However, despite this underlying similarity, desire and aversion are distinguished by their different object or purpose. To see this, let's begin with desire. A desire is an act of the mind in which we wish for some state of affairs to occur. For example, I might desire that somebody be my friend, that a certain candidate win an election, or that I can have a taco salad for lunch. In each case, there is some state of affairs that I hope will occur, or that I wish to come about. In this way, desire is what drives us to pursue some end or goal. Aversion, on the other hand, is more closely associated with avoidance than with pursuit. When we have an aversion to some state of affairs, we wish for that state of affairs not to occur. For example, I might hope to avoid having to fill my car up with gas while driving home, or I might wish to avoid being punished for tax fraud. We should also notice that desire and aversion are closely related to one another. Whenever we desire something, we often have an aversion to the opposite thing. If I want somebody to be my best friend, then I will have an aversion to them rejecting me. If I want candidate A to win the election, then I will find the thought of candidate B winning to be aversive. And if I want a taco salad for lunch, then I will hope to avoid a situation in which the grocery store has run out of lettuce, tortilla chips, cheese, and salsa. It is also significant that Epictetus describes both desire and aversion as demanding something from us. Of course, they demand different things. Desire demands the attainment of something, whereas aversion demands the avoidance of something. Still, each makes some demand upon us. And this language is significant because it suggests that our desires and aversions exert some control over us. If a person demands that we do something, then they are not just asking or suggesting that we do that thing. They are speaking with a measure of authority. When a parent, teacher, or government official demands our compliance, the expectation is that we will obey. These individuals seek to compel us to do something whether we want to do it or not. So what would it mean to say that our desires demand something of us? What would it mean to say that our desires can compel us? The Stoic philosophy requires that we discipline our desires. Learning how to do this ensures that we are in control of our desires instead of our desires being in control of us. But if our desires make demands upon us, if our desires expect, so to speak, our obedience and compliance, then our desires must hold some sort of natural sway over us. There must be something naturally compelling about our desires and our aversions as well. Understanding this is crucial because it implies that we must take active steps to resist the demands of our desires and our aversions when they would have us pursue or avoid things that are not within our power. And ultimately, this is the task of Stoic self-control. One reason we need to control our desires and aversions has to do with the consequences that result when we fail to satisfy our desires or if we fail to avoid our aversions. Consequences that ultimately undermine our happiness and freedom. First, consider the consequences of unfulfilled desire. When we fail to get what we want, the consequence is disappointment. This is something that should be familiar to us. If we strongly desired for candidate A to win the election, and perhaps even helped candidate A's campaign effort, then it would be natural for us to feel disappointed if candidate B should win instead. Our desires attach us to certain outcomes or results, and in doing so, make us vulnerable to feeling disappointment when those outcomes and results do not come to fruition. There is also a negative consequence of being unable to avoid our aversions. Epictetus tells us that the person who cannot help incurring the object of his aversion is wretched. But what does it mean to be wretched, and how is wretchedness connected to suffering our aversions? To be wretched is to be in an unfortunate, undesirable, or lowly state. We can find a perfect example of this in Epictetus' own life story. As discussed previously, Epictetus lived the early portion of his life as a slave. Now, suppose that while in that condition, Epictetus bemoaned his fate and quite naturally found his state of enslavement to be aversive. Suppose that he lamented being forced to live in bondage. In that case, Epictetus would be in a wretched condition. He would be in a situation where he is forced to suffer through what he most wants to avoid, where he is powerless to prevent what he dreads most. And it is this very inability to avoid what he fears most which would also force him to recognize his inherent vulnerability and helplessness. Of course, this is a rather extreme example, but it is extreme examples of this sort which best illustrate Epictetus' use of the term wretched. Furthermore, something like this does happen whenever something happens to us that we were hoping to avoid. We find ourselves in the unenviable position of having to deal with what we could not prevent. This, like disappointment, is another consequence that serves to undermine our freedom and happiness. It is important to realize that Epictetus does not just think that there is a loose connection between desire and disappointment, or a loose connection between aversion and wretchedness. In Epictetus' view, there is actually a very high probability that our desires will make us disappointed, and that our aversions will leave us wretched. In fact, we should really say that there is a certainty of this if we fail to properly control and regulate our desires and aversions. The consequences of disappointment and wretchedness are the inevitable and inescapable results for those who have failed to discipline themselves. But why is this the case? Well, those who have failed to discipline themselves orient their desires and aversions toward external goods that they cannot control. Recall that Epictetus claims that things like body, property, reputation, and office are beyond our power and not within our control. So, suppose someone desires wealth and finds the state of poverty to be aversive. This individual wants something and wants to avoid something that is not entirely within his control. Now, there are steps a person can take toward becoming wealthy, and they may even succeed. But even so, none of our efforts can guarantee that we maintain our wealth. A market crash could put us into financial ruin, or our well-thought-out business plan could still fail, sinking us into horrible debt. Beyond this, no matter how well we are able to secure our fortune, whatever goods we have attained in this life will always eventually be taken from us by death. The demand made by our desire for wealth or desire for any other external good cannot be permanently satisfied. If we desire any external good, then disappointment and wretchedness are the inevitable result. Furthermore, if disappointment and wretchedness prevent us from flourishing, then we have a strong reason to restrain our desires and aversions. Specifically, we have a strong reason to train ourselves to not desire any external goods, and to not find the lack of any external good aversive. In Epictetus' view, this is what provides the primary motivation for embarking on the Stoic endeavor of self-control. Self-control requires regulating both our desires and our aversions. However, it is notable that Epictetus' comments on how we go about regulating each of these are not precisely the same. Let's begin by considering his comments on controlling our aversions. Epictetus tells us that, if then you shun only those undesirable things which you can control, you will never incur anything which you shun. But if you shun sickness or death or poverty, you will run the risk of wretchedness. Epictetus once again relies on the distinction between things that are within our power and those things not within our power. Or more specifically, those things we can avoid and those things we cannot avoid. It is within our power to avoid deceiving ourselves into believing what we know to be false, or aiming at what we cannot achieve. However, outside this narrow sphere, there are many things it is simply not within our power to avoid. This includes the examples that Epictetus mentions here: sickness, death, and poverty. And it is natural that Epictetus would use these things as examples. Each of them is something that people commonly worry about. It is common for us to anxiously wish that we could avoid all of these things. Nevertheless, this common tendency to be averse toward things we cannot prevent, things like sickness, death, and poverty, makes us vulnerable to wretchedness. It is only by limiting our aversions to what is within our power that we can protect ourselves against the threat of wretchedness. For this reason, we need to remove the habit of aversion from all things that are not within our power. We must stop feeling aversion towards things like sickness, poverty, and death. Instead, we must apply our habit of aversion only to things undesirable, which are within our power. Instead of feeling averse toward the thought of being ill or impoverished, and instead of fearing our impending death, we need to transfer these habits of aversion to that which we can control, to that which we can avoid. We need to become the sort of person who feels aversion toward having the wrong kinds of beliefs and having the wrong sorts of desires. It is significant that Epictetus uses the language of our habits of aversion here. he is not just talking about the aversion we might feel at any given moment towards something. Rather, he is talking about the habitual reinforcement of that aversion that occurs over time. There are two reasons why this point is significant. First, if some aversion is habitually ingrained, then the reason it exists in us may not be because of any deliberate act of our will. Take, for example, the common aversion to being sick. Where did this aversion come from? We likely cannot think of some particular point in time where we decided to find illness aversive. We just notice ourselves feeling this way. And this feeling could have numerous sources. The most obvious would be our prior unpleasant experiences of being sick. The more this occurs, the more deeply ingrained will be our aversion to illness. Furthermore, there could be a social and cultural element. Growing up around others who find illness aversive, who show us pity when we are sick, seeing commercials for medicine that is meant to help us overcome illness, all of this would contribute to reinforcing our aversive feelings toward sickness. In some cases, the source of an aversion could be almost entirely social and cultural. Take our common aversion to death. The reason people are fearful about death is not because they have experienced it and found it unpleasant, as might be the case with sickness or poverty. Rather, it largely comes from a socially and culturally reinforced anxiety about the unknown. In our minds, we find the thought of ceasing to exist to be troubling, and this feeling is reflected back to us by other people who feel the same way. The significant social component of our fear of death is further evidenced by how people can sometimes lessen their aversion to death through belief in certain religious accounts of an afterlife. This tells us something important about what is required to transfer our habits of aversion away from what we cannot control. If our aversion to these things did not result from a deliberate act of our will, then neither will some deliberate act of our will get rid of these habits of aversion. If we did not will our aversion of sickness, poverty, and death into existence, then neither can we simply will our aversion of these things out of existence. Rather, counteracting the ingrained habits of aversion we feel toward these things requires a sustained process of training meant to reverse those habits. And in fact, the practice of meditating on the reality that certain things are not within our control, and the practice of reminding ourselves that sickness, poverty, and death are among those things, is an integral part of the Stoic endeavor to control our aversions and regulate our emotions. Epictetus advises us to restrain our desires in a similar fashion, and as we have seen, doing this is necessary to avoid disappointment. We are in control of whether we believe what we know to be true and of whether we have goals and aims that are within our power to attain. As such, we can desire these things without running the risk of disappointment. However, it is not within our power to ensure that we are healthy and wealthy, neither is immortality within our power. Thus, if we desire these things, we will necessarily be destined for disappointment. Just as Epictetus claims that we must regulate our aversions to avoid wretchedness, so he also recommends regulating our desires to avoid disappointment. And so that means to this extent, we should take the same basic approach toward both desire and aversion. However, Epictetus also identifies an important asymmetry in the way we should approach desire and aversion. When discussing aversion, Epictetus readily recommends that we shun those undesirable things we are able to control. He had no qualms about telling us to transfer our habits of aversion away from those things we cannot prevent toward those things we can prevent. If we fear death, then we should work to remove that fear and instead direct our aversion towards self-deception or unrealistic desire. The important point here is that Epictetus sees no reason to worry about aversion itself. His concern is simply that we feel aversion toward the right things. However, this is not the case with desire. Epictetus tells us that, for the present, altogether restrain desire. Whereas our aversions should merely be redirected, Epictetus tells us not to indulge our desires at all. At least at the present, before we have properly trained ourselves in Stoic practice, we should strive to live devoid of any desire. So, what is the reason for this asymmetry? Why is Epictetus more worried about desire than he seems to be about aversion? Based upon the text alone, it is difficult to answer this question. However, I will suggest one line of reasoning that Epictetus may have had in mind. Epictetus is concerned about our ability for self-control and about how we can best develop this capacity. Furthermore, as with any task that takes training and effort to master, a beginner should be given more freedom in those aspects of the task which are more manageable, and less freedom in those aspects which are more difficult. So the question is, what is more difficult to control? Our desires or our aversions? Is it more difficult to regulate our fears and anxieties, or is it more difficult to rein in our desires? Epictetus evidently believes that aversion and the fear it produces is at least somewhat easier to control. To see why, let's consider one of the aversions we discussed previously, our natural aversion to death. Now, to say that overcoming this kind of fear or aversion is easier certainly does not imply that it is easy. Our fear of death is one of our most deeply ingrained fears. Yet despite this, good reasons can be brought forth for why there is no reason to fear death. And in fact, many philosophers have discussed these reasons. We might start by noticing that death is simply the cessation of our present consciousness, and there is nothing inherently painful or uncomfortable about the mere fact or state of lacking consciousness. This is something we can realize by reflecting upon the fact that we go to sleep each night. We might also notice something that Epictetus himself discusses explicitly. Death is inevitable and unavoidable, and perhaps it makes no sense to fear something we know cannot be avoided no matter what we do. The point here is that our fears are often amenable to being controlled by rational reflection or broader experience. To see this, think of something you have been fearful or anxious about in the past. You may have noticed that in some cases, once you actually experienced that thing, then the thing you feared was not really what you thought it would be. Perhaps once you were honest with yourself about why you feared that thing, you were able to realize that your fear had no rational basis, that your fear was based upon certain unfounded assumptions. Of course, for Epictetus, this will always be true whenever our fear or aversion is based upon the desire for some external good. When we fear becoming ill, upsetting a friend, becoming impoverished, or losing our reputation, we are always fearing something that is beyond our control. And this sort of fear always implies the false belief that it is within our power to avoid these things. Thus, if we can get rid of these false beliefs, we can also get rid of our aversion to things beyond our power. Desire, on the other hand, may not be as easy to control. Denying ourselves our aversions is more freeing and less onerous than denying ourselves our desires. When we overcome our fear of death, embarrassment, or failure, we will likely feel a sense of freedom and accomplishment. Those feelings of fear or anxiety may creep back upon us, but we will not likely feel tempted to give in to them. The case seems different with desire. Each time we fulfill our desires, no matter how destructive in the long run, we experience some pleasure and fulfillment in the moment. If we manage to repress our desires, we may see the wisdom in doing so, and we will likely be happy about it, all things considered, but a part of us may also wish we could go back to how things were. And this is precisely because of the pleasure that accompanies desire. There's nothing particularly pleasant about being someone who fears death, but there is something pleasant, at least in the moment, about being someone who indulges their immediate wants. In fact, this is the very nature of temptation. For this reason, it makes sense that Epictetus would encourage us to develop the right kinds of aversions, but caution us against having any desires at all. Desire is simply more difficult to restrain, and as such, should only be pursued once we have strengthened our ability to focus only on what is within our control. These considerations about the nature of desire and aversion leave us with some important questions about the process of developing self-control and of training for the Stoic life. And I will address some of these questions in the next video entitled Stoic Practice and Living Well, and you can find a link to that video in the description section below. The following is a preview of some of the questions that still need to be answered. First, we know that we must overcome our habit of feeling aversion toward things like sickness, poverty, and death. Instead, we need to develop a general aversion to concerning ourselves with things that are beyond our control. But how do we accomplish this? Overcoming our aversion to death and disease is not an easy task. So what are some steps we can take toward developing the habits of the Stoic life? Secondly, we need to think further about Epictetus' injunction that we give up all desire. We can see why he would say this. At the same time, there does seem to be a real practical difficulty here. How can we live completely without any desire? If we lack all desire, then what will make us care about future states of affairs? What will motivate us to undertake actions for the sake of necessary ends and goals? In the last sentence of Enchiridion section 2, Epictetus seems to recognize these difficulties. He states that where it is practically necessary for you to pursue or avoid anything, do even this with discretion, gentleness, and moderation. So here he seems to recognize the practical inevitability of desire. If that is the case, if it is ultimately impossible to live completely without desire, then that means our focus needs to shift to the question of how do we pursue our desires in the right way. He tells us we should pursue our desires with discretion instead of carelessness, gentleness instead of belligerence, and moderation instead of intemperance. It is only in this way that the practical affairs of daily life can be rendered consistent with the practice of preparing ourselves to live as Stoics.